My name's Madison. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Ohio. Honestly, I'm not proud of what I'm about to share, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. A few days ago, I said something incredibly stupid, something so bad that my husband Ethan, who's 36, packed his things and left. I have no idea if he's coming back. And the worst part? It all started over dinner. Yeah, dinner. Of all the things to argue about. Right? Ethan came home from work. Exhausted as usual. He works crazy hours at a financial consulting firm and makes good money, enough that I don't have to work. Some people would call me a housewife. But honestly, I don't love that term. I've never seen myself as the perfect homemaker type. I'm more into fashion, makeup, and keeping up with trends. You know, the things that make life a little less boring. Anyway, that night, I decided not to cook. It had been one of those days where I got caught up scrolling on Instagram and watching back-to-back episodes of a true crime docuseries. Before I knew it, it was 6 p.m., and I figured, why not just order takeout? We've got the money, so it's not like a big deal, right? Ethan didn't see it that way. He walked in, glanced at the spotless but empty kitchen, and gave me that look. You know, the one that's a mix of disappointment and frustration. The kind that makes your stomach sink. He dropped his bag and said, "You've been home all day. The least you could do is make dinner." That one comment lit a fire in me. I told him I was tired too. And he snapped back, saying something like, "Tired from what? Watching Netflix? You don't contribute financially, so the least you could do is handle the house." That was a low blow. I mean, okay, I'm not scrubbing floors every day or baking bread from scratch. But I do keep the house looking nice. And let's not forget, I put effort into looking good for him. Isn't that what guys want? A wife who's attractive and well put together. That's when it happened. I don't even know where the words came from. But before I could stop myself, I said, maybe if you made as much money as Jason, we wouldn't have to worry about stuff like this. We could just eat out all the time. Jason, my ex. Yeah, I went there. The second the words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. Ethan's face went pale, and his jaw tightened. He didn't yell or throw anything. He just stood there, silent, like he was trying to process what I'd just said. Then he turned around and walked out of the room. I didn't follow him. I thought he'd cool off. Like he always does. And we'd talk it out later. But when I went upstairs a couple of hours later, his suitcase was open on the bed. Half packed. I tried to act calm. Like this was no big deal. What are you doing? You're not seriously leaving over this. Are you? Ethan didn't even look at me. He kept packing, muttering something about how he couldn't believe he'd wasted years trying to make this marriage work. That's when the panic started to set in. I told him I didn't mean it. That it just came out wrong because I was frustrated. But he wasn't buying it. He said something like, "It's not just this one thing. Madison. It's everything. You don't appreciate anything I do for you. You spend money like it's nothing. You don't take anything seriously. And now you're throwing Jason in my face?" I'm done. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was overreacting. But I couldn't find the words. Deep down, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. Sure, I shouldn't have brought up Jason. But it's not like Ethan's perfect either. He's always so serious, so focused on work. And half the time, I feel invisible unless I've done something to upset him. So yeah, he left that night, took his suitcase, got in his car, and drove off without saying where he was going. I stayed up, replaying the fight in my head, convinced he'd come back by morning. He always does, but this time, he didn't. Now, I'm sitting in this big, quiet house, wondering if I've messed things up beyond repair. Part of me feels like this is on him. If he appreciated me more, I wouldn't have felt the need to say what I said. But another part of me knows I crossed a line. And I don't know if I can fix it. I thought about texting him. But what would I even say? "Sorry for comparing you to my ex." Doesn't really cut it. Does it? So instead, I'm just here, waiting to see if Ethan will come back or if this is the end of everything we've built together. Ethan didn't come back the next morning. By the time I realized he wasn't just cooling off, I started to panic. I told myself he just needed time. But the silence was unbearable. I spent most of the day pacing the house, staring at my phone, debating whether I should reach out first. It wasn't like Ethan to leave and not say where he was. Sure, we'd had fights before, plenty of them, but he'd never stayed gone overnight. I tried convincing myself that he was just at a friend's place or maybe a hotel. He'd probably come back after work, and we could hash this out. But when the hours passed and the house stayed empty, I knew this wasn't like all the other times. By late afternoon, I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again, and then again. Same thing. I even sent a text. Ethan, can we just talk? Please come home. I know I messed up. And I want to fix this. No response. I felt my stomach twist into knots as I stared at my phone, waiting for the screen to light up. I hated feeling ignored, and Ethan knew that. The silence was messing with my head. So I decided to send him a voice note. Maybe if he heard the sincerity in my voice, he'd realize I wasn't trying to start another fight. Ethan, I didn't mean what I said about Jason. It was stupid and hurtful. And I'm sorry. You know I don't care about him. Honestly, I only stayed with him back then because he had money. And even then, I couldn't stand him. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just got frustrated, and the words came out wrong. Please, just come home so we can talk this through. I hit send and immediately regretted it. The way I'd phrased it made it sound worse. Like I was admitting I'd used Jason for his money and that I might be doing the same to Ethan. That wasn't what I meant. But I couldn't take it back now. Hours passed with no response. And by the time the sun set, I was convinced I'd made things worse. Then, just before 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Thanks for confirming what I've suspected for a while. You just use people for what they can give you. I guess I'm no different. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. His words were cold, sharp, and impossible to misinterpret. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong. But part of me knew he wasn't entirely off base. I'd always loved the stability Ethan gave me. He worked hard, provided a good life, and never complained, until now. I called him again, desperate to set things right. To my surprise, he actually picked up. What do you want, Madison? His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. Like he was barely holding back anger. I want to fix this, I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. You're making it sound like I don't care about you at all. And that's not true, isn't it? He shot back. You literally just admitted you used Jason for his money. How'd I know you're not doing the same thing to me? Because it's different, I snapped, the words tumbling out before I could think them through. Jason was a jerk who treated me like crap. You actually care about me. You're nothing like him. Am I? Ethan's voice was steady, but the bitterness was clear. Because from where I'm standing, all I do is pay the bills and make your life easier while you sit around and complain that I don't do enough. Do you even hear yourself? I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being unfair. But deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. I hated admitting it, even to myself. But I'd gotten comfortable. I wasn't exactly putting in the same effort Ethan was. Ethan, I said softly, trying a different approach. I'm sorry if I've made you feel unappreciated. That was never my intention. But you can't honestly think I'm only with you for your money. There was a long pause on the other end. And for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. But then he said, I need some time to think. Madison, don't call me again until I reach out. The line went dead. And I was left sitting there, staring at my phone. The tears that I'd been holding back finally spilled over. But I wiped them away quickly. I wasn't the type to wallow. But the weight of his words sat heavy in my chest. For the next few days, Ethan's silence was like a dagger. I tried to distract myself. But every corner of the house reminded me of him. His side of the bed. The coffee mug he used every morning. Even the jacket he'd left hanging by the door. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to drive to his office. If he wasn't coming home, at least I'd know where he was. But when I got there, I was met with another shock. Ethan wasn't at work either. One of his coworkers told me he'd taken a few personal days. I drove home fuming. Where was he? Why wouldn't he just talk to me? As much as I hated to admit it, a dark thought crossed my mind. What if he was staying with someone else? I shook the thought away, telling myself Ethan wasn't like that. But as the hours dragged on, my anxiety only grew. I needed answers, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could wait for him to give them to me. By the fourth day, I was teetering between panic and anger. Ethan's silence was deafening, and the longer he stayed away, the more unhinged I felt. I had no idea where he was or what he was thinking. And my mind kept spiraling into the worst-case scenarios. Was he with someone else? Was he really planning on leaving for good? The thought of him moving on while I was stuck in this limbo made my stomach churn. That evening, I decided I couldn't sit around waiting anymore. I'd thought about calling him 100 times. But every time I reached for my phone, I hesitated. Instead, I went back to what I do best, taking matters into my own hands. Ethan wasn't exactly tech-savvy, and I knew his email password. It was an old habit of his to use the same password for everything. And honestly, I wasn't proud of what I was about to do. I told myself it wasn't really snooping. I just needed a clue about where he might be. Maybe he'd booked a hotel or made some kind of reservation. Something that would give me a sense of what was going on in his head. I logged in, half expecting to feel a wave of guilt. But instead, I was hit with something much worse. Right there, at the top of his inbox, was an email from a real estate agent. The subject line read, "Follow up on your inquiry." My heart started racing as I opened it. The email was short and professional, just confirming an appointment Ethan had scheduled to tour an apartment later that week. An apartment. Not a house. Not a vacation rental. An apartment. For one person. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call him. But I knew how that would go. Straight to voicemail. Just like every other time I'd tried. So instead, I sat there, staring at the email, trying to process what it meant. Was this really happening? Was Ethan actually looking for a place to live without even telling me? I tried to tell myself there had to be some other explanation. But deep down, I knew the truth. He was planning to leave. Furious, I grabbed my phone and left him a voicemail. I didn't even try to hide the anger in my voice. So, what? You're apartment hunting now? Is that your big solution? Ethan? Running away instead of dealing with our problems? Call me back. I hung up and immediately regretted it. I sounded desperate, and the last thing I wanted was to give Ethan the upper hand. But the truth was, I was desperate. Desperate to figure out what was going on in his head. Desperate to stop him from walking away from our marriage. The hours dragged on with no response. And by the next morning, I was ready to drive myself crazy. I decided to text him again. This time trying to sound calmer. Ethan, I saw the email about the apartment. Can we please just talk? If you're that unhappy, I deserve to know why. It took him hours to reply. When he finally did, the text was short and cold. I'm not making any decisions yet. I just need space. Space. That word made my blood boil. Space to do what? Tour apartments? Move on with his life while I sat here waiting for him to decide whether I was worth the effort? I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, thinking about what to do next. I thought about calling his family or his friends. But I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. And honestly, I wasn't sure they'd even take my side. Ethan was the kind of guy people respected. Reliable, hardworking, the nice guy everyone rooted for. Me? I knew what people thought about me. High maintenance, self-absorbed, the kind of woman who didn't know how good she had it. The idea of people seeing me as the villain in all this made my chest tighten. But I pushed the thought aside. I needed to focus on Ethan. On fixing this before it was too late. That night, just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Meet me at the coffee shop downtown tomorrow at 10. If you want to talk. That's where I'll be. I stared at the message, unsure how to feel. Relief? Anxiety? It was the first real contact I'd had from him in days. But it wasn't exactly the warm reconciliation I'd been hoping for. Still, I told myself it was a step in the right direction. The next morning, I got to the coffee shop early, hoping to collect my thoughts before Ethan arrived. But when I walked in, he was already there, sitting at a table in the corner with a coffee in front of him. He looked calm, too calm, and it made my stomach twist. I slid into the chair across from him, feeling like I was walking into a courtroom. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "you're looking at apartments now?" Ethan didn't flinch. He just looked at me. His face unreadable. "It's exactly what it looks like. Madison, I'm moving out." I blinked, caught off guard by how matter-of-fact he sounded. "You're what?" "I've already started the paperwork for the divorce," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been talking to a lawyer for weeks. I just needed to get a few things in place before I told you." The word divorce hit me like a slap in the face. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice shaking. "You're ending our marriage because of one stupid argument?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't about one argument, Madison. It's about years of me trying to make this work while you took and took and took." "I'm done." I sat there frozen, Ethan's words echoing in my head. "I'm done." It didn't feel real. For years, I'd pushed and prodded, testing how far I could go. But I never thought he'd actually leave. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan was supposed to stick it out. To be the stable one who kept us together no matter what. "Don't act like I'm some villain here," I snapped, trying to push back against the panic rising in my chest. "I've put up with plenty from you too. You're always working. Ethan, you never make time for me. And now you're just walking away without even giving me a chance to fix things?" He shook his head, a look of weary disappointment on his face. "You had plenty of chances. Madison, my family warned me about you. My friends warned me about you. But I didn't listen. I thought I could make it work. I thought if I loved you enough, you'd change. But you haven't. And I'm done sacrificing my happiness for someone who doesn't appreciate me." His words felt like a punch to the gut. But what stopped me cold was the way he was looking at me. There wasn't any anger left, just exhaustion. He'd made up his mind. And I could see there was no changing it. Before I could argue, Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. "And before you ask, yes, there's someone else." It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You're cheating on me?" I spat, louder than I intended. Ethan didn't flinch. "Don't try to play the victim. Madison, you've been using me from day one. At least with her, I feel like a person, not just a wallet." "Her. Of course. There was a her." My hands curled into fists under the table as I fought to keep my voice steady. "Who is she?" I demanded. "How long has this been going on?" He sighed, like he couldn't believe I was even asking. "Her name is Sophia. She's been a friend for a while. But things didn't get serious until I realized this marriage was over. She actually listens to me. Madison, she supports me. And unlike you, she doesn't make me feel like I'm never enough." The name hit me like a slap. Sophia, sweet, perfect, low-maintenance Sophia. I could picture her already. Probably one of those women who never raised her voice. Who cooked dinner without being asked. Who always had a smile on her face. The kind of woman Ethan always thought I'd turn into but never did. "So, what?" I snapped, grasping for something to hurt him with. "You think she's so perfect? Just wait. She'll get tired of you too once she realizes you're not exactly a prize." Ethan didn't take the bait. He just looked at me like I was a stranger. "I've already wasted too much time on you. Madison, I'm not doing this anymore. The papers will be ready next week. You can keep the house. But I'm out." He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out without looking back. I sat there, staring at the empty chair across from me, my mind racing. Divorce. He was serious. Ethan was really leaving. And not just for a night or a few days, he was done. At first, I felt anger. How dare he throw away everything we'd built together? How dare he blame me for all of this when he wasn't perfect either? But as the minutes ticked by and the reality sank in, the anger gave way to something else, fear. What was I supposed to do now? For years, Ethan had been my safety net. The one constant in my life. Sure, we fought, but he always came home. He always forgave me, and now he was gone. The rest of the week passed in a blur. I stayed up late drinking wine, scrolling through social media, and obsessing over Ethan and Sophia. It didn't take long to find her. A mutual friend had posted a picture of them together at some work event months ago. She was exactly what I'd imagined, soft, sweet, and everything I wasn't. Seeing her face made me want to scream. I told myself it wasn't fair, that she didn't deserve him any more than I did. But deep down, I knew the truth. Ethan wasn't leaving because of her. He was leaving because of me. By the time the divorce papers arrived, I was numb. Ethan had already moved out. And from what I'd heard through mutual friends, he was staying with Sophia. I signed the papers without a fight. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The house felt emptier than ever after he left. For years, I'd complained about Ethan being too busy, too serious, too focused on work. Now I'd do anything to hear the sound of his voice, to see him sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop. I thought about calling him, begging him to come back, promising to change, but every time I picked up the phone, I stopped myself. What was the point? Ethan had made it clear he was done, and I wasn't sure I could convince him otherwise. Instead, I threw myself into distractions. I downloaded a dating app, went out with a few guys, and tried to convince myself I was moving on. But none of it helped. Every date felt like a bad imitation of what I'd had with Ethan, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop comparing everyone to him. At night, I lay awake, replaying our fights in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. If I'd been more supportive, if I'd appreciated him more, if I'd never mentioned Jason. But it was too late for what ifs. Ethan was gone, and he wasn't coming back. The divorce didn't take long. Ethan was nothing if not efficient. Within a month, the papers were signed, the assets divided, and just like that, I was officially on my own. Ethan kept his promise about the house, leaving it to me, but it didn't feel like the victory I thought it would. Sitting in this big, empty place now felt more like a punishment, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. The first few weeks were the hardest. Every room was haunted by the ghost of our life together. The bed felt too big without Ethan next to me, and the silence in the mornings was suffocating without the familiar sound of him clinking his coffee mug or typing away on his laptop. I'd sit on the couch at night, scrolling through social media, hoping for some sign that he missed me. But instead, I found photos of him smiling. And then there she was. Sophia. She was in almost every photo, at a restaurant with him, laughing at some outdoor event, or simply walking by his side. The two of them looked so comfortable together, like they'd been a couple for years instead of weeks. It made me sick, not just because I was jealous, though I was, but because Ethan looked genuinely happy. Happier than I'd seen him in years. At first, I told myself it was just a phase, that he was rebounding, that it wouldn't last. But the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't some fleeting fling. Ethan had moved on, and he'd moved on with someone who, in every way, seemed like the complete opposite of me. Meanwhile, I was stuck. The bills started piling up faster than I expected, and it became clear that the spousal support Ethan was giving me wasn't going to cover my lifestyle. I had to cut back on everything. No more online shopping sprees. No more salon appointments. No more dinners out with friends. Even worse, I had to sell a few of my designer bags just to make the mortgage payments. For years, I'd taken for granted that Ethan would always be there to pick up the slack. I never thought about how much it actually cost to maintain the life we'd built together. But now, I had no choice. I told myself I'd figure it out, that I'd get a job and prove I didn't need Ethan or anyone else. But the truth was, I had no idea where to start. I hadn't worked in over a decade, and even before I married Ethan, my work history was, let's just say, unimpressive. A string of retail jobs, most of which I quit after a few months because I couldn't stand the hours or the customers. Now, at 32, I felt like I had no real skills and nothing to put on a resume. I applied to a few places out of desperation, mostly boutiques and small shops downtown, and finally landed a part-time job at a clothing store. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was laughable compared to what I'd gotten used to. But at least it was something. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the loneliness. For years, I'd taken for granted that Ethan would always be there. Even when we fought, I knew he'd come home at the end of the day. Now, the silence in the house was deafening. I thought about reaching out to my friends, But most of them were married with kids. Too busy with their own lives to deal with my drama. And the ones who did call only wanted to gossip about the divorce. Not actually help. I tried dating. Mostly out of spite. I downloaded a couple of apps. Went on a few dates. But it was a disaster. Every guy the first met seemed either uninterested or way too interested in all the wrong ways. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop comparing them to Ethan. I hated myself for it. But I missed him. I missed the way he'd laugh at my terrible jokes. The way he'd roll his eyes when I spent too much on shoes but still paid the credit card bill without a word. I even missed the fights because at least when we were fighting, he cared enough to argue. One night, after too many glasses of wine, I broke my own rule. I called him. It went straight to voicemail, of course. But I left a message anyway. Ethan, I don't know why I'm calling. I guess I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I didn't treat you the way I should have. And I don't blame you for leaving. I hope you're happy. I didn't expect him to call back. And he didn't. The next morning, I deleted his number from my phone. Not because I wanted to but because I knew I'd be tempted to call him again. Ethan was gone. And it was time for me to accept it. 6 months later, Ethan and Sophia were still together. From what I heard, they were even talking about moving in together. I stopped stalking their social media, mostly because it only made me feel worse. But the occasional update would still trickle in through mutual friends. Meanwhile, my life was a mess. The boutique job wasn't enough to keep the house. And I was running out of options. I hated the idea of selling it. It was the last piece of the life Ethan and I had built together, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Some nights, I'd let myself wonder what might have happened if I'd been different. If I'd appreciated Ethan more. If I'd tried harder. If I'd never mentioned Jason. But those thoughts didn't change anything. This was my life now, alone, broke, and starting over. And Ethan? He was happy, truly happy. It's funny, I used to think he'd never survive without me. But it turns out, I'm the one who can't survive without him. 6 months turned into a year. By then, the house was gone. I couldn't keep up with the mortgage. And no amount of cutting back or selling my things made a difference. The house was too big, too expensive, and too full of memories I didn't want to face anymore. Packing up and leaving was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I cried as I watched the moving truck pull away, knowing that I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving behind the life I thought I'd have forever. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, a one-bedroom with outdated appliances and thin walls, but it was all I could afford. The first night there, I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, and felt a crushing wave of loneliness. For years, I'd taken for granted that Ethan would always be there. Now, it was just me. No husband, no friends, no safety net, just me and the mess I'd made of my life. The boutique job kept me busy. But it wasn't enough to distract me from the thoughts that crept in at night. I'd replay old arguments with Ethan, wondering if there was a moment, one single decision, where things could have gone differently. Maybe if I'd appreciated him more. Maybe if I'd been more supportive. Maybe if I hadn't said what I said about Jason. But regret didn't change anything. Ethan was gone, and he wasn't coming back. I heard through mutual friends that he and Sophia were doing great. They'd moved in together and were already talking about marriage. It stung to know that he'd found the happiness with her that he couldn't find with me. But I couldn't blame him. Sophia was everything I wasn't: kind, patient, low maintenance, the kind of woman Ethan deserved. And then there was me, still struggling to figure out who I was without him. One day, as I was cleaning out some old boxes, I came across a framed photo of us from the early days of our marriage. We were at the beach. Both of us laughing, the sun setting behind us. I remember Ethan had insisted on taking the picture even though I'd complained about my hair being messy. But when I looked at the photo, all I could see was how happy we were. We didn't have much back then, just a tiny apartment and dreams we hadn't figured out yet, but we had each other. And for a while, that was enough. I sat there staring at the photo, tears streaming down my face. Realizing how much I'd taken those moments for granted. I'd spent so much time focusing on what I thought I deserved that I never stopped to appreciate what I had. By the time I realized how much Ethan meant to me, it was too late. For months, I'd been angry at him for leaving. I told myself he was the one who gave up, the one who didn't fight hard enough. But as I looked at that photo, I knew the truth. Ethan had fought. He'd fought for us for years. Even when I made it almost impossible, I was the one who didn't fight. I was the one who took and took until he had nothing left to give. That realization hit me like a freight train. For the first time in months, I stopped blaming Ethan and started taking responsibility for my part in what went wrong. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, but it was necessary. I started making changes, not for Ethan, but for myself. I picked up extra shifts at the boutique and saved up enough money to take a few business courses at the local community college. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward building a future for myself. I even started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends. Something I'd always talked about doing but never actually did. It felt good to do something that wasn't about me for once. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I wasn't the same person I was when Ethan left. And for the first time, I didn't want to be. I wanted to be better, not for him, but for me. One day, while I was working at the boutique, a familiar face walked through the door. It was Ethan. My heart nearly stopped as I watched him browse the racks, looking as calm and collected as ever. He didn't notice me at first, but when his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he gave me a small, polite smile and walked over. "Madison," he said, his voice even. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Hi, Ethan," I managed, my voice trembling slightly. "How are you?" "I'm good," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "How about you?" "I'm better," I said honestly. "Things have been tough, but I'm figuring it out." He nodded, and there was a long pause before he said, "I'm glad to hear that." We talked for a few minutes, small talk. Mostly, he told me about his new job, how he and Sophia had recently adopted a dog. I told him about the boutique and the classes I was taking. It wasn't an emotional reunion or some grand moment of closure. It was just normal. As he left the store, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't angry or sad. I was just grateful. Grateful for the time we had, even if it didn't last. Grateful for the lessons I'd learned, even if I had to learn them the hard way. Ethan had moved on, and now it was my turn. My life wasn't perfect, and I had a long way to go. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was on the right path. And maybe that was enough. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our future videos. We've got so much more exciting content coming your way, and we'd love for you to be part of our journey. Also, feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.